Alright guys, if you've watched my last couple of videos, then you know that I am struggling right now. I am not reading anything that is really working for me, and so I decided to take a break. I decided to drop my American history, I decided to drop my romance novels, and I decided to go on a binge of something that is my off and on guilty pleasure, which is the British royal family. A while ago now, I did a review of Finding Freedom, not Nelson Mandela's book, but the Harry and Meghan bio of the same title. Talked a lot about that there, had some great discussion, and so I decided, I'd read some new stuff maybe and do a review there. And then I read 3 newish things, and I'm going to talk about all of them for you today. I'm going to start with the one that probably has the least to do with the current stuff going on with the British royal family, but was such a wild listen. I cannot tell you. So I listened to Lady in Waiting, My Extraordinary Life in the Shadow of the Crown by Anne Glenconner. Now, Lady Anne is now in her 80s or 90s, and she's looking back at a life where she grew up in the aristocracy, and she was childhood friends with Princess Margaret and Queen Elizabeth II. She has been around for all of that time, and based on the subtitle, I definitely thought there would be more of that. There isn't as much as I thought. One thing about the audiobook is that Lady Glenconner actually narrates it, which is not necessarily normal in the sense that she's not a professional audiobook narrator, and that's just weird because sometimes you can hear her swallow or turn a page, and that was just really interesting, and I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. What it is about Lady Glenconner's life that I decided to continue listening, even when I realized it was going to be more about her life and less about the royal family, was that her life, it is somehow a marriage of a lifestyle and a life, like an era that I can't possibly imagine. And yet the stereotypical in the dictionary next to keep calm and carry on or stiff upper lip, is this book. It is that personified. Lady Glenconner had a marriage that, while she never comes out and says it, definitely was mentally, if not physically abusive. Her husband was unstable in some regards. She had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 twin girls, and 3 out of the 5 of them had tragedy occur in their lives. And then there's just the crazy adventures that she goes on. Later in life, she does become a lady in waiting to Princess Margaret. There's quite a lot of talk about Princess Margaret, whom treated Lady Glenconner, I would say, in some ways that weren't always very nice, but Lady Glenconner is very defensive of her friend. She very much loved her, is still very loyal, and they went a lot of places together. There's a lot about the island of Mustique, which I did not know much about, but Lady Glenconner's husband helped to basically found and make into the tropical paradise that it is today for the rich and famous. She lived there for a while. They went on many different trips abroad, and also after her husband died and Lady Glenconner didn't have her obligations to Princess Margaret anymore either because she had also died, Lady Glenconner just randomly goes on a trip with an old lady friend, and they're in Russia, and all of a sudden Lady Glenconner realizes that her friend is actually there to hire a hitman. She just says it so matter-of-factly. Anyways, I do think one of the things about this book is that while Lady Glenconner clearly has had progressive changes of thought, especially in terms of mental health and the LGBTQ community, that kind of stuff, when she discusses trips to areas of the British Commonwealth, for example, people dressed in their native garb or just customs that seem weird to her, she's not aggressively offensive, but I felt in the way that she phrased some of that stuff that she is still clearly a product of her time. So there's that. It didn't tell me anything new necessarily, but I listened to it all the way through because her life story was just, it was just wild. Like, I didn't expect that to happen. So if you're bored, it might be a good way to pass some time. I wouldn't say that it's like a must read, but it definitely went some places that I didn't expect. So, wow. So I also read something that was released in April of this year, The Palace Papers, Inside the House of Windsor, The Truth and the Turmoil by Tina Brown. I had low expectations for this book. I also read a different book by Tina Brown several years ago now called the Diana Chronicles. This book is exactly what it sounds like. Tina Brown for a while was the editor of Tatler, which is a British tabloid, very much in the posh gloss scene, ran in all those circles, and so she of course covered Princess Diana for a significant amount of time. I felt with the Diana Chronicles that it was less a chronicle of Diana and more a chronicle of the most wild tales about Diana, and I walked away from it thinking that it read like a gossip magazine, which is fine. I mean, I read the whole thing, but I didn't necessarily expect the Palace Papers to be anything other than that. Why I decided to read it is that I liked the idea of, through the lens often of Diana, looking at the Queen and her relationship with Prince Philip, looking at Camilla, Kate, and then Meghan, and kind of charting how these different outsiders who married into the royal family, what their journey was. And what I think this book did a really good job of was also showing how that journey was very specific to its time. Prince Philip, very specific to his gender, and Camilla obviously having the before Diana period and the after Diana period. This book did not read like a gossip magazine. It was much more, I don't want to say even toned, but when Tina Brown would bring up, XYZ said this, she would name her source, which is, I always appreciate, and didn't necessarily take things that we don't know are facts as facts, if that makes sense. So just because Meghan tells this story this way and someone else tells this story a different way, Tina Brown says that there's two different versions and doesn't just pick and choose the most wild as the truth. So I actually really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed, seeing the different attitudes, hearing the different stories. I wouldn't say that Tina Brown is not a fan of Meghan. I think her point is simply that there were all of these other people who had difficult paths towards becoming a member of the firm, and there were some things you should have known to expect, even if Meghan didn't, Harry should have, and that there was something significant to Meghan being American and not really understanding the culture in the same way that everyone else was British did. But again, could have learned. And if she didn't, Tina Brown says that's on her and Harry. So again, she's not anti-Meghan, but her point of the book is there's all this historical precedence and journey that could have been examined for them. So I had such a good time with that book that I decided to read another book that I had seen multiple times in my local bookstore and in my local library, because I was just loving it. And this one was awful. So the book here in question is Brothers and Wives: Inside the Private Lives of William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan by Christopher Anderson. In a way, it functioned as the perfect co-book to the Palace Papers, because the Palace Papers is very female oriented. Again, while it discusses Prince Philip, it's very focused on Camilla, Kate, and Meghan. And in this book, while Kate and Meghan are in the subtitle, they are not the focus. This book starts with William and Harry, from when they became brothers all the way up until now. While their wives factor in, obviously they've been around less than the lifetime of the boys together, and they have gone through less together. I knew immediately that I was going to have an issue with this book. The book starts off setting the scene at the so-called Sandringham Summit when Harry, William, Charles, and the Queen all got together to discuss Harry and Meghan departing the royal family. And this is not like a true quote, but it's like, William sat by the window feeling anger roiling in his stomach. And I was like, I hate this. I do not want people to characterize nonfiction settings for me like that. You can say that William was known to be angry, but like, don't fictionalize it, because immediately I don't understand what you're making this scene out of, where you've gotten this information, and I don't trust it. And as we were going further and further into the book, the whole portion that is like Charles and Diana's marriage, for example, 90% of what Christopher Anderson relays as fact is what Diana said in either mostly her book, Diana, Her True Story by Andrew Morton, or the interview with Martin Brashear. I'm not saying those things are false, but I am saying that some of those stories have been contested, but because for some of those stories the contested version is not as dramatic, it seems like Christopher Anderson just decided we're going to take the more dramatic version of everything as fact. And I don't like that, especially when I know that there are contested versions of stories, especially when you're relating something to me as fact and you've never told me who said it or where you got this information from. And then again, choosing at some moments to fictionalize some of these events, into a narrative form, as if Christopher Anderson not only knew these details, but knew the inside of Diana or William or Harry or Charles's minds in particular. And that just did not sit well with me. There's also no new information in this. And at least with the Palace Papers, you might not get new information, but by putting those stories side by side in that way, I think Tina Brown is making a larger point about how different people have become part of the royal family from the outside. And this is just, for Christopher Anderson, really just a relation of different news stories I've already heard. And at this point also, again, Tina Brown is making a larger point that can kind of stand up as this story unfolds, but there's already been new news stories since Christopher Anderson published this book, and it makes it feel out of date and boring. Out of the three of these, if you were going to read one, read the Palace Papers. I enjoyed it. I think it was well written. Again, if you're like a deep royal family person, again, it might not offer you new information. I just thought it was written in an engaging and interesting way, and as someone who engages with this topic off and on briefly, I liked it. I learned some new stuff. As someone who engages with this topic briefly off and on, I did not learn anything new from Christopher Anderson's book. I didn't like the way that it was written. It just felt boring and rehashing, and I didn't like the way that he wrote about some of the events. Lady in Waiting is like its own thing. It's its own category, and so maybe you're someone who's like already read all these books and needs something new. That might be of interest to you, but that book is a cultural artifact and a wild autobiography related to the royal family. So there's a couple of different avenues you could go down on there. Pick the one that works the best for you. I have just enjoyed my break from books that just weren't doing it for me, and so even though the Christopher Anderson really didn't do it for me, it was just nice to just pause and try to recalibrate my reading and hopefully go into my next romance novel or my next American history, politics, whatever book with a little bit of like a deep breath. So if you have other recommendations for me for the British royal family that you think I should check out, let me know. If you've read any of these and agree or disagree, you can always let folks know down below. These are only my personal opinions, and that doesn't mean that they are the end-all be-all. And I'm sorry, my air conditioner has been going this entire time, but it's 90 degrees out. So here we are. Thanks, guys. Bye.